17 years. That's how long it had been since the night my father shut the door in my face and declared I was no longer his daughter. 17 years filled with silence, distance, and a wall of words that were never spoken. And then, there he was, sitting only 2 rows in front of me at my younger brother's wedding, his shoulders squared, his presence still heavy, as though he believed he owned every room he walked into. I had promised myself not to approach him. I wasn't there for him. My only plan was simple: show up, smile for my brother, raise a toast, and quietly leave before old wounds started bleeding again. But the past has a way of chasing you. Ghosts don't ask for permission before they return. He tilted his head slightly, just enough for his voice to drift back toward me. His lips curled into a sneer, his eyes shining with that same cold steel I remembered from childhood. "If it weren't for pity," he said, his voice sharp enough to cut the air, "no one would have invited you." 5 words, that was all, but they pierced me more deeply than I cared to admit. Around us, conversations dimmed. I could feel eyes shifting toward me, whispers rising and falling like moths fluttering around a flame. But I didn't flinch. Instead, I lifted my glass of red wine, let the taste sit on my tongue, and smiled. Because deep down, I already knew what was about to unfold. The bride, glowing with youth and champagne, walked toward the center of the dance floor. A microphone trembled slightly in her hand. She paused, her eyes glancing toward me, an almost rehearsed look before she spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice steady and clear, rising above the clinking of cutlery and the soft music in the background. "Before we continue tonight, it is my honor to recognize someone who has given more to this country than most of us can imagine. Please stand with me and welcome Major General Davis." For a moment, the entire hall went still. Then came the sound. Chairs scraping, feet shifting, applause breaking into thunder. My brother froze, his face pale with shock. My father's expression drained of color, his rigid posture suddenly brittle. That was the moment I had carried in my heart for years. It wasn't about revenge, it wasn't about punishment, it was about recognition I had earned. You probably want to know how I got here. How the girl who once ironed her father's uniforms became the woman introduced to a crowded hall as Major General Davis. Let me take you back. I grew up in a house where discipline wasn't just encouraged, it was enforced like law. My father, Sergeant Major Robert Davis, retired from the Army, was a man carved from stone and steel. He lived by rank, by order, by obedience. In his dictionary, respect flowed in only one direction, toward him. To him, sons carried the family legacy. Daughters? They were meant to stand quietly at the edges, seen but never truly valued. I was 10 years old when he first told me I'd never wear the uniform. We were watching a parade on base, soldiers marching in flawless formation, brass instruments gleaming under the sun. "Dad," I whispered, tugging his sleeve, "I want to do that one day." He didn't even glance down. His eyes never left the soldiers. "Leave the uniform to men who can handle it," he muttered. The words settled in my chest like stones. My throat tightened, but I refused to cry. Tears weren't allowed in our home. Tears didn't bring comfort. They only brought lectures. Still, I didn't let go of my dream. Quietly, in secret, I studied his military manuals when he wasn't watching. I memorized rank insignias. I learned how to polish boots until I could see my reflection in them. Maybe he didn't notice. Or maybe he did and chose to ignore it. By 17, I had already filled out my application to West Point. The night I told him, I expected anger. Instead, I received something worse. He stared at me as though I had spoken heresy. Then he walked to the door, opened it wide, and said calmly, "You want to be a soldier? Fine. Start by surviving without me. Get out." My mother pleaded, her voice trembling against his thunder. But he didn't waver, so I packed a single duffel bag and walked out into the night. The smell of his cigars clung stubbornly to my clothes. I didn't see him again for nearly 2 decades, not until that wedding night. But don't mistake this for tragedy. What he meant as exile became the fuel that carried me through everything. Every mile I ran, every blister I bled through, every instructor who told me I didn't belong. All of it echoed with his words, "Get out." And silently I answered, "Watch me stay." Those first years were brutal. I had no family cheering for me, no letters from home, no one waiting on the other end of a phone line. My younger brother sent me only one note, a short message scribbled on a piece of paper. "Dad says you'll come back when you fail. I hope you don't." I kept that note folded in my locker, a talisman, proof that someone, somewhere, still believed in me. The academy wasn't kind. My male classmates mocked me, tested me, waited for me to break. But I didn't. I refused to. One pull-up at a time, one marksmanship score at a time, one field exercise at a time. I earned every single thing they said I couldn't. And when the day came to pin my first bars, I stood taller, not because he was watching, but because I knew he wasn't. His absence was the fire that forged me. So as I stood in that wedding hall, wineglass in hand, listening to applause rise around me, I didn't see revenge. I saw the culmination of sleepless nights, of scars both visible and hidden, of soldiers who had once whispered, "Thank you, ma'am. You saved me." My father's sneer meant nothing anymore. The bride's voice carried what he never could. Major General Davis. And that was only the beginning. Discipline wasn't just something my father valued, it was something he enforced like an unbreakable chain. Our house never felt like a home. It felt more like a barracks. Shoes lined up by the door, each pair angled to perfection. Dinner served at exactly 1800 hours, no excuses accepted. Chores completed to his standard, inspected as if we were recruits in training. To outsiders, it might have looked like structure, maybe even admirable. But to me, it was suffocating. It was constant inspection under a floodlight that never switched off. My father wasn't what people call a bad man. He didn't raise his hand to us, and he wasn't a drunkard. He lived with control. But that control came at a cost. He carried himself like every moment was still a deployment, and his family, my mother, my brother, and I, were soldiers under his command. My mother tried to soften the edges. She was a teacher, gentle by nature, with chalk on her fingers and shelves full of poetry. When he worked late, she would sit at the edge of my bed, whispering verses from Emily Dickinson as if they were scripture. "Hope is the thing with feathers," she'd murmur, her voice like a balm against the rigid silence that otherwise filled the house. But when the front door opened and his boots struck the floor, hope folded its wings and silence returned. He reserved his pride for my younger brother, Matthew. Every spelling bee ribbon, every little league game, every small victory, he applauded Matthew as if he already carried the weight of the family flag. And me? I was the shadow in the corner, the daughter whose role was to press his uniforms on Sunday nights, careful not to crease a single line. The one who shined his boots until they gleamed like mirrors. The one who ironed while overhearing his stories of bravery, told only to my brother. I still remember being 10 years old, standing beside him at the Army-Navy game. The stadium roared, cadets marched in flawless formation, flags waving, brass gleaming. My heart swelled, and I tugged at his sleeve. "Dad," I whispered, "I want to do that one day." He didn't even look at me. His lips curved into a smirk. "You'll never wear those colors. Leave the uniform to men who can handle it." The words pierced me like shrapnel. My mother saw my face fall, squeezed my hand, but she didn't challenge him. She rarely did. so I stayed quiet. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I simply watched and learned. When he wasn't looking, I studied his medals, tracing the battles etched on their plates. I ran laps around the block until my lungs burned. I locked myself in my room to do push-ups, memorizing strategies from borrowed manuals hidden under my pillow. If I couldn't breach his fortress of approval, then I would build my own, brick by brick, step by step. The first crack came when I turned 16, had won a leadership award at school. My mother's face glowed with pride as I laid the certificate on the dinner table. My father didn't even lift his gaze from his plate. "That's nice," he muttered, stabbing at his peas. "But leadership isn't learned in classrooms, and it certainly isn't meant for girls." I wanted to shout, to rip the paper in half and throw it back at him. Instead, I swallowed my anger, cleared the dishes, and scrubbed until my hands stung. That night, I made myself a promise. His dismissal would never be the last word on who I was. 2 years later, the acceptance letter arrived. Thick paper, bold crest, heavy with destiny. West Point. I remember clutching it in my hands, heart racing. "Dad," I said, holding it out as if it were an offering. I got in. For 30 long seconds he stared at the letter, his jaw tightened, his eyes hard. "So you're serious about this nonsense?" "I am," I whispered. Instead of anger, he handed me a manila folder. Inside were applications, nursing, teaching, law. Each one neatly filled out with my name. Not a single one bore the insignia of West Point. "Pick one," he said coldly. "Do something useful. Don't disgrace the family." The silence that followed was unbearable. My mother's eyes shimmered, but she stayed quiet. Matthew shifted uncomfortably, torn between us. I folded the letter back into its envelope and pressed it to my chest. "I'm going," I said at last. That was the night the ground beneath us split wide open. 17 years later, I still remembered the sting of that moment. Sitting at my brother's wedding, wine glass in hand, I could see it all. My father standing with folded arms, dismissing me like I was nothing. He believed he could erase me with silence. What he never understood was that silence, in the right hands, can cut sharper than any blade. The night I walked away from home, the air smelled of tobacco and leather, the scent of the chair he used like a throne. I carried one duffel bag slung over my shoulder, holding a few clothes, a pair of running shoes, and that acceptance letter folded carefully in the side pocket. My mother's voice trembled as she pleaded, "Please, Robert, don't do this." But his face was carved from granite, his arms crossed, his tone frighteningly calm. "You want to play soldier? Then start now. Out." Those were his last words to me for 17 years. Matthew stood behind him, his expression torn. He opened his mouth, but our father's glare silenced him. I caught his eyes just for a second, filled with apology, helplessness, and then I stepped into the night. The door slammed shut behind me. The sound echoed like final judgment, cutting me off from the only family I had ever known. The first weeks were merciless. I slept on a friend's couch, worked late shifts at a diner to buy textbooks, trained before dawn, pushing my body past exhaustion. When West Point sent its prep list, 5-mile runs, pull-ups, obstacle drills, I followed it religiously. Sweat froze on my skin, muscles screamed, but I forced myself to keep going. Every push-up became an answer, every mile became defiance, every drop of sweat was a rebellion, and in my head, his voice echoed, "You'll never make it." But I whispered back, "Watch me." When I finally arrived at the academy, I expected hardship, but I hadn't anticipated the loneliness. Other cadets had families cheering in the stands, parents snapping photos, hugs and kisses exchanged before the journey began. My spot in the bleachers stayed empty. That night, alone in my bunk, I unfolded the acceptance letter again. just to remind myself that I belonged, even if no one believed it. Cadet life was fire, and I was forged in it. Early morning drills, endless inspections, instructors barking until their voices cracked. Some classmates quit, some thrived. Me? I endured. Male cadets jeered, waiting for me to stumble. "Go back to ironing uniforms, Davis," one sneered. I stared at him, mud streaking my face, sweat dripping into my collar. "I'll race you to the finish," I said. And I did. I beat him by 10 minutes, hauling not just my own rucksack, but a wounded teammate's as well. After that, the mocking grew quieter. Not gone, but quieter. And while my mailbox stayed empty, one thin envelope arrived one day. My hands trembled as I tore it open. It wasn't from my father. It was from Matthew. "Dad says you'll come back when you fail. I hope you don't." 7 words. But those words carried me through countless nights. Graduation day at West Point came like a storm I had been running toward for years. The parade grounds stretched wide, filled with cadets standing tall in crisp uniforms. Sabers gleamed overhead as families filled the bleachers, waving flags and snapping photos. Proud parents clapped and shouted names into the wind. I searched the crowd out of habit, eyes darting from face to face. But the space where my family should have been was empty. The ache was sharp, but I refused to let it break me. I straightened my spine, pressed my hand in salute, and marched forward. Because I had learned something vital. Family didn't always mean blood. Sometimes, family was forged in mud, sweat, and fire. My first posting was Fort Bragg. Days blurred together, drills, logistics, stacks of paperwork that never seemed to end. Nights were lonelier. There was no one waiting at home, no letters tucked under my door. But I had purpose. And for a while, that was enough. Until deployment came. That's when purpose grew teeth. The first time I stepped off a C-130 into desert heat, it slammed into me like a furnace door. Dust clogged my lungs, coated my skin, stung my eyes. Soldiers around me looked twice my size, their faces hidden behind sunglasses and steel. One muttered under his breath, "What's she doing here?" I pretended not to hear, but I heard every word. I always did. It didn't matter. I wasn't there to prove them wrong. I was there to prove myself right. The mission was simple, at least on paper. Escort supply convoys through contested ground in Afghanistan. Keep the trucks moving. Watch for IEDs. But war doesn't care about paper. The desert sun burned down mercilessly, turning body armor into ovens. My squad shifted restlessly, some humming, some scanning the ridges. Then it came. The first gunshot split the air like lightning. Then a rattle of fire poured down from the ridges above. "Contact! Left!" someone shouted. Bullets chewed through metal, shattered glass. I dove behind a container, weapon raised, pulse pounding. Training took over. Short bursts. Control your breath. Count your ammo. And then I heard it. A scream. Not fear, but raw pain. A soldier was down. I sprinted through the gunfire. Rounds hissed past, close enough to feel their heat. A private lay in the dust, his leg shredded, blood pooling fast. His face was ghost white. "You're not dying today," I barked, dropping to my knees. My hands worked faster than my thoughts. Tourniquet high on his thigh, cinched tight until he bit down on his sleeve to keep from screaming. Pressure on the wound, one hand slick with blood, the other gripping the radio. "Medevac, this is Lieutenant Davis. Coordinates, immediate extraction needed." Gunfire roared closer. My side burned. Shrapnel had torn through my vest, but I barely registered it. I pressed harder, refusing to let go. We dragged him 40 yards under fire. Each step felt like eternity. The helicopter finally roared in, rotors beating the air. We shoved him onto a stretcher. I climbed in after him, hand still pressed to the wound. By the time we landed, I was soaked, his blood and my own mingling together. They tried to put me on a stretcher too. I refused. I walked off under my own power, not because I wasn't in pain, but because the men were watching. That day, I earned a new nickname, Iceback. They said I bled ice, not blood. I didn't care about the name. What mattered was that the private lived. Years later, he wrote me a letter, telling me he named his daughter after me. That meant more than any medal could. But that day changed me. Until then, I thought I was chasing approval, trying to prove I belonged in a world shaped by men like my father. After that firefight, I understood something different. Belonging isn't given. It's claimed, forged in fire, sealed in blood. That night, I called home. Stitches tugged at my side as I leaned against a barracks wall. "Dad," I said to the answering machine, voice low. "I made it back. Thought you should know." The call was never returned. Silence was my only reply. I sat in that room, listening to the desert wind rattle the windows. My hands shook from pain and exhaustion. For the first time, I realized something. If blood wouldn't claim me, then honor would. That was the night I stopped reaching for him. That was the night I learned to stand alone. Combat doesn't change you in explosions and movie scenes. It changes you quietly, in ways that stay buried in your bones. After Afghanistan, I walked differently, breathed differently, even thought differently. Every scar, every stitch reminded me, leadership isn't medals. It isn't salutes. It's carrying weight when no one else can. Back in the States, I buried myself in work. Endless training, logistics, rotations. Fluorescent lights buzzing overhead while papers stacked high on my desk. Other officers chased promotions with polished smiles. I chased competence. Proof. A record no one could deny, even if they wanted to. And they did want to. Being a woman in uniform was like walking a tightrope strung over a minefield. Too soft, and you were dismissed. Too tough, and you were labeled. But I learned to balance. One day, a corporal under my command froze during live fire. His hands trembled, rifle slipping. I pulled him aside, looked him straight in the eye. "You're not weak," I told him. "You're scared. That's different. Fear means you're paying attention. Now use it." He swallowed hard, nodded, and finished the drill. A year later, I received a letter from him. "Ma'am, you're the only one who ever saw me." That line stayed with me, because I knew what it felt like to be invisible, and I swore no one under my command would ever feel that way again. My reputation grew, not because I shouted the loudest, but because when things went wrong, people turned to me. Officers above me noticed, reluctantly at first. Then came commendations, new assignments, responsibilities no one else wanted but everyone respected. I rose, lieutenant to captain, captain to major. Each promotion was another rung on the ladder, a ladder I hadn't just climbed, but built with my own hands. Every milestone carried the same ritual. I picked up the phone, dialed home, and left messages. "Dad, it's me. I just pinned captain today." "Dad, I was promoted to major." Each time the machine picked up. Each time silence answered back. Still, word trickled through the grapevine. Old army buddies, family whispers. They told me what he said, that I was softening the military, that I was only a symbol, that my achievements weren't real. But when I looked into the eyes of the soldiers under my command, I knew the truth. They didn't follow me because of a name. They followed because I had proven again and again that I would bleed beside them if necessary. By then, my brother Matthew had carved his own path. Law school, a high-profile firm in D.C. His photo splashed across magazines about rising young attorneys. My father bragged about him at every veterans hall in town. Me? I remained the exile. The daughter whose name was never spoken at the Yetacium. dinner table. But I didn't crave his applause anymore. I had found something else, a chosen family, soldiers who stood shoulder to shoulder in the mud, who carried my weight as I carried theirs. In quiet moments, though, I thought of my mother. I remembered the way she used to read poetry under the soft glow of a lamp, her voice wrapping me in warmth that my father never gave. Sometimes, alone at night, her words returned like echoes. Hope is the thing with feathers. And I realized, hope, not anger, had carried me farther than anything else. By the time I pinned on the silver eagle of a colonel, I understood the truth. Legacy isn't inherited, it's earned, one choice at a time, and my choices had built something stronger than blood. I had built myself. Then came the call. A Tuesday morning. I had just finished a run, sweat cooling on my skin, when my phone buzzed with a number I didn't know. It was Matthew. His voice was low, clipped. "Mom's in hospice. Breast cancer. She doesn't have long." The world narrowed to a pinhole. I hadn't heard his voice in years, and now he was telling me that the one gentle presence in our home was fading. I booked the first flight back. The hospice smelled of antiseptic, sharp and sterile. My mother lay in the bed, frail and pale, her hair gone, her skin paper thin. Tubes whispered beside her. My father stood in the corner, arms folded, jaw tight. He didn't move when I entered. Her hand lifted weakly when she saw me. I rushed to her side, still in a wrinkled uniform from travel. She smiled faintly, lips cracked but warm. "Keep flying," she whispered. Just 3 words. But they shattered me. She was gone before sunrise. At her funeral, I wore my dress blues. My father never once met my eyes. He spoke of her kindness, her patience, her loyalty, but not a single word was directed toward me. Afterward, I returned to base, waiting for some sign. A letter, a call, anything. Instead, I received an email. 3 sentences. "The funeral was nice. I hope the army is treating you well. I still don't understand your decision." That was it. Cold, detached, not love, not pride. Just a wall, reinforced yet again. I stared at those words until they blurred on the screen. Then I closed the laptop and went back to work. Because work was the only thing that never turned its back on me. The army consumed me in those years. Deployment after deployment, assignment after assignment. If the family I was born into didn't want me, then the one I chose, the one in uniform, would get every ounce of me. But service carries a cost. Nights intense, sand whipping against the canvas, scars aching from shrapnel still lodged in my side. Mornings when I dragged myself up despite pain screaming louder than alarms. I learned to live with it, to move through pain as if it were just another order. Promotions came. Lieutenant colonel, colonel. Each should have felt like a victory. Instead, they felt like markers in a marathon I was running alone. I mailed him photos once, a picture of me in full dress uniform, holding a distinguished service medal. I even sent a copy of the ceremony program. No reply. Later, I heard from one of his old army friends that he had stared at the picture for a long time before tearing it in half. That stung more than I wanted to admit. Still, I climbed. By then, I had become known for reforms. I saw soldiers breaking under the wrong pressures, injuries ignored until they became permanent, minds left unattended until lives unraveled. So I pushed back. I rewrote training protocols. I demanded better safety standards. I created programs for resilience, for mental health. It wasn't glamorous. It didn't make headlines, but it saved lives. And slowly, respect followed. Not the hollow kind that comes from rank, but the genuine kind you can see in the eyes of those you lead. I built something my father could never take away. Still, at night, silence weighed heavy. I would sit in my quarters after long missions, peel off my uniform, and stare at the empty chair across from me. The absence cut deeper than the scars. But bitterness doesn't build. It corrodes. So I chose something else. Resolve. Every slight, every dismissal, every silence became fuel. Brick by brick, I built a fortress inside myself. By the time I pinned on the eagle of a full kernel, I no longer reached for the phone. I no longer chased his approval. I had stopped running toward him, and in stopping, I had finally found peace. By the time I reached the stars of a brigadier general, I thought nothing about my father could surprise me anymore. Silence had become the steady background noise of my life, like static on a radio I had long since tuned out. And yet, hope is stubborn. When the official orders came through, promoting me to general, I wrote him a letter, handwritten, deliberate, each word chosen like a soldier picking careful steps through a minefield. Dad, I know you never agreed with my path, but I want you to know, I carried your lessons with me. Discipline, honor, responsibility. I brought them into every command, every mission, every life I was entrusted with. Today, I was promoted to brigadier general. Even if you can't say it, I hope somewhere inside you, you know I've done right by the uniform. Your daughter. I sealed the envelope and mailed it, telling myself not to expect anything. But expectation has a way of hiding inside you, no matter how many times you deny it. 2 weeks later, one of his old army friends approached me at an event. He still called me kiddo, though I had stars on my shoulders. He said my father had read the letter 3 times before tearing it in half. I thanked him politely and walked away, jaw tight. That night, in the silence of my office, I let the anger come. Not the fiery, explosive anger of youth, a colder, heavier kind, the kind that seeps into your bones. That was the night I stopped writing to him. If he wanted silence, then silence he would have. Around that time, Matthew called. His voice was careful, like he was balancing glass in his hands. "I want you at my wedding," he said. I hesitated. "Does Dad know?" "He does," Matthew admitted. "He's not happy. But this isn't about him. It's about me. You're my sister. Please come." 17 years had passed since the night my father told me to get out. 17 years of distance measured not in miles, but in missed birthdays, empty chairs, funerals, and milestones celebrated alone. But this was my brother, the boy who had once slipped me notes of encouragement when I was alone at the academy. The boy who had watched me leave with a duffel bag and eyes full of apology. So I said yes. As the wedding approached, old memories clawed their way back. Him slamming the door, the folder of applications he had tried to force on me, the empty rose at every ceremony, the cold email after Mom's funeral, written like a memo instead of a farewell. I told myself I was ready, that I had endured heat, mortar fire, and nights darker than anything a wedding could bring. That he couldn't touch me anymore, not my rank, not my worth, not the soldiers who would follow me into hell. And yet on the day itself, my stomach still twisted into knots as I buttoned my uniform. The medals caught the light, heavy reminders of the lives I had lived, the sacrifices I had made. I stared into the mirror at the 4 stars on my shoulder and whispered, "This is who you are, not his disappointment, not his exile, a general." The wedding was beautiful. White roses lined the aisle, a string quartet filled the air with soft music, and guests moved with joy and laughter. Matthew looked nervous but happy as he stood waiting at the altar. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw him, my father, older now, hair grayer, shoulders smaller, but his posture was unchanged, rigid, arms crossed, scowl etched into his face. For a second, I was that teenage girl again, standing with an acceptance letter in my hands, begging him to see me. Then he turned, leaning just close enough for only me to hear. "If it wasn't for pity," he sneered, "no one would have invited you." The words slid under my skin like shards of glass. 17 years, and nothing had changed. I lifted my wine glass, took a slow sip, and smiled. Because this time, I carried a truth he didn't. This time, I wasn't walking into exile. This time, I was walking into reckoning. The reception hall buzzed with laughter, silverware clinking, champagne flutes raised high. I sat with my back straight, uniform crisp, 4 stars gleaming. Most guests didn't recognize the weight those stars carried, but I did, and so did he. Even after all these years, he tried to command the room with his presence. But not here, not anymore. I sipped my wine slowly. I didn't need to answer his sneer with words. Life had already answered for me. Then the music softened. The bride, radiant in lace and pearls, walked to the center of the dance floor. Her hands trembled slightly around the microphone. She cleared her throat and smiled nervously. "Before we continue tonight," she began, "I'd like to take a moment." The room hushed. "Weddings are about families coming together," she said, her voice steady now. "And tonight, I want to acknowledge someone whose sacrifice and service have shaped not just this family, but this nation." She turned toward me. Her eyes locked on mine, full of respect. "Please rise," she said clearly, "and join me in honoring Major General Davis." For a heartbeat, the hall froze. Forks hovered in midair, glasses paused before lips. Then slowly at first, chairs scraped back. One by one, guests stood. Applause rolled like thunder across the room. I stayed seated, letting the sound wash over me. Faces blurred together, but one face remained sharp and clear, my father's. His knuckles whitened as he gripped the edge of the table, jaw clenched so tightly it looked carved from stone. He didn't move. He didn't stand. Matthew's eyes flicked between us, caught in the silence. The bride, tears glistening, repeated the words, "Major General Davis." The applause grew louder, swelling into a standing ovation. Finally, I rose, slowly, deliberately, my glass still in hand, heels clicking against the polished floor. I didn't bow, didn't wave. I simply inclined my head, a soldier's nod. "Thank you," I said, voice steady, clear, carrying across the hall. The ovation lasted longer than I expected, long enough for people to glance at my father, waiting for him to rise. He never did. And that was when it hit me. Revenge doesn't always arrive in anger or shouts. Sometimes it comes in silence, breaking in a way someone else cannot control. That night, revenge wasn't my voice. It was theirs. It was the sound of an entire room standing while he sat alone. Blood refused to stand, but honor did. Afterward, guests approached me. Strangers shook my hand, thanked me for my service. Some shared stories of their own fathers or brothers who had served. Others simply said they were proud. I responded with gratitude, polite but firm, though the gravity of his silence weighed at my back. I half expected him to leave, to walk out in rigid defiance, but he stayed, glued to his seat, refusing to meet my eyes. And strangely, it no longer mattered. The recognition I had chased for so long was never his to give. It was already mine. As the night wore on, the room filled again with laughter and music. Couples danced beneath chandeliers, champagne glasses clinked, and joy settled back over the hall. I sat for a while, quiet, watching, feeling something I hadn't in years, a mix of peace and ache. Matthew came over, tugged at his, "You okay?" he asked softly. I nodded. "I am." He hesitated, then said, "You deserve that. Every bit of it." And for the first time that evening, I allowed myself to breathe. Because he was right. The wedding ended as weddings do. Music fading, guests slipping into the night, shoes in their hands, ties loosened. I stayed until the very end, hugging my brother, watching the joy on his face as he and his bride walked out under an arch of sparklers. My father left quietly. No goodbye. No words. Just a rigid back disappearing into the shadows of the parking lot. I thought it would hurt more, but instead, I felt lighter. Because I finally understood. His silence was no longer my burden. It was his. For years I had carried it like a rucksack, heavy and crushing, believing that if I achieved enough, earned enough, climbed high enough, he would finally see me. But that night, as strangers applauded while he sat stone still, I realized something. I didn't need him to see me. The world already did. Weeks later, a letter arrived at my office. The handwriting was shaky, but familiar. I didn't stand because I didn't know how. I don't understand what you've become, but I know it's more than I ever gave you credit for. If you'll allow it, I'd like to talk, not as soldiers, not as ranks, just as father and daughter. I read it 3 times. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I just set it down and sat in silence. That evening, I told my husband. Yes, I had a husband by then, I said with a small smile. He asked gently, "Do you want to see him?" "I don't know," I admitted. "I don't owe him anything." "No," he said. "But maybe you owe yourself the choice." A month later, I met him at Arlington. Not at a hall filled with applause, not at a wedding, but at my mother's grave. He wore civilian clothes, looked smaller, older, no medals, no pins, no armor, just a man who had outlived too much of himself. We talked quietly, not about wars, not about medals, about regrets, about silence, about the cruelty of absence. And when we parted, he did something I'll never forget. He straightened slowly, raised his hand to his brow, and offered a salute. Not sharp, not perfect, but honest. I returned it. Not because he had earned forgiveness, but because, for the first time, he had chosen truth. The years that followed brought new commands, new missions, new responsibilities. But that moment at Arlington, standing across from my father at my mother's grave, never left me. I didn't carry it as vindication. I carried it as proof. Proof that even walls built over decades could crack. One day, a young lieutenant under my command asked me, "Ma'am, what's the most important lesson you've learned in your career?" I didn't hesitate. "Respect isn't inherited," I said. "It isn't guaranteed by blood or name. Respect is earned by showing up when no one else will, by standing tall when silence tries to bury you, by carrying weight that others drop." She nodded, but I could see the words sink deeper than her salute. Because I wasn't just answering her. I was answering the girl I once was. The one who ironed uniforms in silence, who held an acceptance letter like a lifeline, who left home with nothing but resolve and a duffel bag. Now, as I sit here telling you this story, I want to leave you with a question. Who stood for you when no one else did? When did you rise above what was meant to break you? If you've carried silence, rejection, or doubt, I want you to know this. There will come a moment when the world finally stands for you. It may not come the way you expect. It may not come from the people you thought would give it. But it will come. And when it does, you'll understand what I did, that some salutes come from blood, but the ones that matter most come from choice, from those who decide you are worth standing for. And those salutes, they last forever. So if this story moved you, I ask you, pause for a moment, reflect, maybe share your own story in the comments. And if you'd like to hear more journeys of courage, of justice, of finding strength when it feels impossible, subscribe so we can walk through these stories together. Because no one rises alone, we rise together.